So again, now we're on to chapters 13, 18, and 19, exam review. And so starting with chapter 13, investing fundamentals, we're looking basically in with chapter 13 again, is that for example, by studying the basic investment principles presented along with information on such things as stocks, bonds, mutual funds, real estate, and other alternatives that we kind of glossed over, we touched upon a bit as we've gone through, we'll be able to create an investment plan that is custom made for you. And this is, again, these are things that you're looking at this, so you want to personalize this as much as possible. So anyway, so establishing those investment goals, they have to be useful, and investment goals must be written, very specific and measurable. Once again, it's just the same idea that we had before about whether we're talking about setting up Excel spreadsheets or so on and so forth, but just to walk through this very thoughtfully, right? So investment goals must be tailored to your particular financial needs, meaning where you're at. Are you married? Or do you intend to anticipate being married, having children, so on and so forth? All these things have to kind of be brought into the picture, and it changes, of course, over time because you change over time. So again, you're always looking for the future. All right. So to start with, we're looking at the performing your financial checkup. So before beginning an investment program, uh, all those things that we talked about before, paying your bills on time, working to balance your budget. And this is always a work in process. It's something that we're always having to deal with. We're always living on the margins one way or the other. So managing your credit card debt is again back to the beginning, starting an emergency fund equal to at least 3 to 6 months of your living expenses, and always having some access to other sources of cash for emergency needs, such as either credit card advances, family members, so on and so forth. Right? You have to have it pretty close at hand, if you will. So managing, such things as financial crises as they come up, and what we mean by that again is that while typical personal finance course is not an economics course per se, it does have some basic, you have to take under basic considerations, economic considerations. And again, the economics is, the author describes it as study of wealth, how it's created and distributed. It's actually more a study of scarcity, but it's neither here nor there. You get the idea. So a nation goes through business cycles and economic cycles, and economic cycles are when there are downturns, of course. It's going to be reflected in such things as your investments for sure. There could be a downturn in your investments. It could go drop down from where you started, or if the economy is on the upslope, then your investments might be growing faster than you anticipate. So again, we're looking at kind of trend analysis, looking at the overall, but there are going to be ups and downs. There are going to be valleys and peaks, if you will, going forward. So especially, there's always some reference to the most recent financial crisis, and uh, we're we've gone through many things in the recent past, including 2008, the financial collapse due to, at least in part, the housing crisis, the credit crisis associated with that, and there was a collapse, of course, in financial asset values, home values, and it was a very, very tough time. And more recently, of course, with the COVID crisis, the financial implications of that, which will be felt, of course, going forward. So looking at that overall big picture, right? So to manage this financial crisis, many experts recommend they take action to ensure that your financial affairs are in order. So if it's specifically establish a larger than normal, if you will, emergency fund. Know what your debts are. Know what your debts are, and typically this is what happens anyway when we're in an economic downturn. You reduce spending, especially on bigger ticket items. You pull back on buying new cars and so on and so forth, right? Um, and as ever, you uh, uh, notify your credit card companies if there's a problem, so on and so forth. Be very, very much upfront. Monitor the value of your investment retirement accounts. again, if the economy is, think about it, there's an expression, the rising tide raises all boats, meaning, of course, that when times are good, then you don't really pay as close of attention. But when times are bad, that's when people really start to monitor their financial situation, especially if they're experiencing losses. So, with that in mind, uh, be sure to be aware of it, but at the same time, it's not always the right thing to act because, again, another one of those adages: buy low, sell high. So you don't sell off your portfolio if the economy is going into a downturn, because it may well, or in most all cases, will rebound and hopefully rebound quickly. Anyway, so consider the last thing, of course, is consider converting investments to cash to preserve value if the economy really is rock bottom. Anyways, you get the idea. There are a lot of things that can go along with it. So now, getting your money to start with, how do you get your money to start an investment program? Um, and so once you've established your investment goals and completed all your financial checkup to see where you're at, it's time to start investing. And so you assume, hopefully, you have enough money to finance your investments, if you will, to get the ball rolling. So prioritize, if you will, your investment goals. So what is important to you, and maybe the most important part of a successful investment program. What is it that you value? How the time value of money affects your investments, affects your investments. We've gone over this time and time again. The longer the lead time, the longer that you're separated from your money, the higher rate of return that you would expect and actually demand. So if you start an investment program when you're young, you let the time value of money work for you and make and you make sound investments. Remember, long term. Think long term. You want to worry about finances and hopefully you want to worry about finance as much, or financial issues, when you reach that the golden age, so to speak, of retirement, right? Um, this is why it's critical. This goes back and forth between uh, whether or not, when you're young, uh, it's people have a tendency, when they don't have much money, they want to avoid a lot of risk, which makes some sense, right? You don't have much money, so you're afraid you might lose it. But having said that, when you're young and you've got a long window of investment ahead of you, this is actually the time when you do want to be in uh, uh, riskier investments, if you will. But you have to be very careful about this. I say this guardedly because, again, people will take this, from what I'm saying, and will say, "Oh yeah, my professor said that you should invest in very risky financial instruments." No, what I'm saying is that when you're younger, you can afford a bit more risk because you don't need the money right away. So it's a longer window, if you will. And I refer back to this is the only investment I offer, if you will, and because I'm not a financial planner. I'm not a certified financial planner, et cetera. So the only thing I recommend for people is uh, to invest, if they can, in mutual funds, and you want to invest in index mutual funds, and you want to invest in very, very broad-based index mutual funds. And the reason you do that is because that tracks to the market. So if the market's up, you're going to be experiencing positive returns. If the market's down, it's going to be you're going to have lesser returns. But having said that, you're not going to be losing everything. It's you're tracking the entire market anyway. So there are a lot of calculations and so on and so forth that go with this, and you should definitely go through and revisit those calculations that are associated with that. So onward, anyway. So let's move on to the factors that are associated with the factors affecting your choice of investments. So although each investor may have specific individual reasons for investing, there are a number of factors that all investors must consider: safety and risk. So safety and risk are two sides of the same coin. Safety is an investment, which means minimal risk or loss, right? On the other hand, risk in an investment means a measure of uncertainty about the income. So when you're young, you're not concerned so much about the income. You're concerned about the income that you're going to be getting at a much, much later date. Keep that in mind. This is, again, kind of the rationale behind why we actually want to have a fair amount of risk in our portfolios very early on. So investments, again, range from very safe to very risky. At one end of the investment spectrum are very safe investments that attract very, very conservative investors. And a lot of this has to do with your age. You're back to our life cycle hypothesis. When you're young, you can afford a bit more risk. When you're older, when you're in retirement or very close to retirement, this is when you want to be focused more on what? Safety. Consider that. So when investors pick such investments, again, because they know there's a little chance of the investment becoming worthless, that's on the safety side. On the other end of the investment spectrum are very risky investments. And you can get to the point where it's speculative. I'm not saying to go to speculative investments, but again, when you're younger, you want to have a bit more risk in your portfolio, if you will. The risk-return trade-off. So the risk-return trade-off, you may experience two types of risk with most investments. Investors often choose some risks because they provide predictable source of income. In reality, there's a risk that you will not receive those periodic income payments. Second type of risk with many investments is that the investments will decrease in value. So first is that you may not realize the dividend that you were hoping for, and second, the investment that you have may not actually appreciate or grow in value. So those are kind of the risks that we're evaluating. So evaluating your tolerance of risk. So investing, not everyone has the same tolerance for risk. I mean, even setting aside age, some people can't deal with it. Some people just can't deal with the risks that are associated with some of the riskier investments, so they opt to go with safety. My suggestion on this is to walk through and do kind of a self evaluation. Are you a risk averse person? Not a bad thing, right? To be risk averse, you're avoiding risk as much as possible. However, keep in mind that there are other parts that flow into this risk as well. For example, if you are too safe, you have a very, very safe investment, and it's not likely that you'll lose your investment. The value is likely to you're likely to not, again, lose the investment. But the problem with that, of course, is that with the very, very low risk and a very, very safe investment, you are subject to much, much lower interest rates. And remember a rule of 72. So if you're getting 2% return on your investment, and if you had a riskier investment, it might get 5, 6, 7, 8, 9% rate of return. So there's that part of it. You're giving up a lot in foregoing all that risk. And secondly, there's such things as inflation that could come into play. Of course, that depends upon the time whether inflation is present or not, but this is also another concern. So back to these components of the risk factor. Again, we already talked about inflation risk, interest rate risk, business failure risk, market risk, global risk, all these different types of risks. And inflation risk is straightforward. The value of your portfolio could be falling, if you will, if you don't, unless you're getting a high enough rate of return to offset that inflation risk. Interest rate risk is when you invest in something and interest rates go up, and if you're stuck investing in that security, you're stuck at a lower rate of interest, and as a result of which that overall security that you have in your possession is worth less because the interest is not high enough. Business failure risk is associated with, very similar to the market risk, is that the company itself could fail. Market risk, of course, has to do with what? The ups and downs associated with the market. Global investment risk has to do with the international framework of the same, right? So onward, investment income. So we're talking about investment income. Sometimes, in general, what happens is that people prefer certain investments because they want predictable source of income. The safest, back to the safe, and the safest investment would be your passbook savings account, certificates of deposits, and securities issued by the U.S. government. And they're all predictable sources of income, albeit very, very low. And so if income is your primary objective, most investors choose a little bit more risk, but nonetheless, these are bonds, and bonds in the form of municipal bonds, corporate bonds, preferred stock, utility stocks, or common stocks, or selected common stocks. So this is moving from probably lower risk municipal bonds to higher risk when we talk about selected common stocks. And when we're talking about these, we're looking at dividends. We're looking at some income that will be flowing through to the shareholder. Other investments that could provide income are, again, through mutual funds and real estate rental, being a landlord, right? So when purchasing investments for income, we should be concerned about the ability of the person or the entity in which you're lending. That's really what this is debt we're talking about, the ability for them to pay back. So moving from income to growth, to investors' growth means that their investment will increase in value, so we're less concerned about the dividend, the profit sharing for the owner of the asset, if you will, and more concerned about increasing the overall value of the stock, or the price of the stock. Companies with better than average earning potentials, there's a lot of they're riskier, is what we're saying. So these are stocks, mutual funds, and real estate. So finally, when we talk about the last piece that we're looking at here is investment liquidity. It kind of ties the two together, and in general, we're saying that liquidity is the ease with which an asset can be converted to cash without a substantial loss in the face value or the dollar value of that asset. It's pretty straightforward. So onward we go. So if we're looking at asset allocation and investment alternatives, this is actually drilling down on how we go about doing what we're talking about. And by now you're probably thinking, I can choose the right investment from, how can I choose the right investment for me? So to help answer those questions, we want to consider just a few things of the following. Since World War II, stocks have returned an average close to 10% a year, well ahead of the nation's inflation rate. So stocks, equity investment, stock investment in the shares of stock that everyone is familiar with, returned about 10%. It's probably closer to 8% if we look at the long scope, meaning the last 100 years. But anyway, since 1926, it's kind of interesting. Stocks have positive gains in 65 years, and conversely, in the same time frame since 26, stocks have lost money in like 25 years. So that's just in general. We're looking at the overall stocks have gained over that period of time rather than losing, and overall it's at about a 10% average gain on an annual basis. So in reality, stocks have a place in every investment portfolio, but there's more to establishing a long-term investment program than just picking a bunch of stocks. This goes back to mutual funds. Asset allocation, diversification. Asset allocation is the process of spreading your assets among several types of investments. Don't have all of your eggs in one basket. Simply put, asset allocation, what it really means is that you need to diversify to avoid, again, putting all those eggs in one basket. This is a common mistake. So typical asset classes includes, it goes from large cap or larger corporations, medium cap, and then small cap or small corporations. And also we could throw foreign stocks, bonds, and cash into that mix, into that mix, if you will. So many financial experts argue that asset allocation is the most important factor when establishing a long-term investment program, because choosing the right mix of those assets will outperform the investment selections that individual investors make over a long period of time. And the reason that what I'm saying is that you want to spread this out is because it seems in some ways counterintuitive, because you think you're spreading it out, and so you're going to be picking, you're putting winners and losers together. The problem is that when you're picking stock pickers, everyone is an expert on these things until the bottom falls out. The idea is that the reality is that no matter how well your stock is performing, there's a good chance, not just an outside chance, there's a certainty actually out there that it's going to underperform at some point too. So it's going to be up and down, going with or counter to the business cycle and within its own framework. So this is why you want to spread your investments out as much as you possibly can. So furthermore, along that indexing topic that I mentioned before with mutual funds, looking at large, medium size and small corporations or small companies, you want to overspread to spread your investment across as many as you can, especially if you're young and you have at least let's just say a 10-year window before you're going into retirement. So that would mean for most people anywhere from age 20, we'll say, to age 60. You want to have a good mix of investments, but I urge you to look into mutual funds, because with these mutual funds in particular, it's not that I've got favorites, but the ones that I've looked at and probably focused on the most would be like Vanguard or Fidelity mutual funds, because they are they're index funds. The total market index fund is the one you want to look at, because it has large, medium, and small depending upon the value. So it's skewed more toward the larger companies. Nonetheless, if you have the large, mid cap and the small cap in your portfolio, and that way you're picking up, if the market goes up, the broad market goes up, then your investment goes up. If it goes down, your investment may fall off a bit too, but in general, back to where you're kind of going with the flow, if you will, right? So again, moving on. Anyways, I'm dawdling a bit here. So the time factor, the amount of time your investments have to work for you, is again really the most important thing. If you leave your investments alone, let them work for 5 or 10 years or more, then you can invest in, back to what I said about the stocks, but more importantly, mutual funds. On the other hand, if you need your investment money in the short term, if you're approaching retirement, you may want to look more at, in terms of bonds and more safer assets, if you will. Finally, with your age, back to what I was saying before, here's just a rule of thumb. Younger investors are more less, whether or not you're more risk averse or not, or less risk averse, you should be in riskier assets, if you will. If you're younger, older investors should probably move more toward the conservative side. So financial experts, this is something just as, again, kind of rule of thumb, is that they suggest that you just subtract your age from the number 100. The difference is the percent of your assets that could be invested in growth investments. So you're 50 years of age, so half of your investments would be in growth assets, and the other half would be in more conservative assets. So stocks, growth, mutual funds, or bonds for the conservative side. So anyways, here's just a quick overview of your investment alternatives. Once you've considered all those risks that we're talking about, we want to, just as a side note, I want to talk about debt versus equity. So when we talk about debt, that is the more conservative side. Those are bonds and so on and so forth, versus equity, which are stocks and and stock-based mutual funds. Mutual funds can be either stocks or bonds, frankly. And depending upon what you want to invest in, you can spread it through that way as well. But so back to when we talk about what it is that we're actually trying to focus on. We would, if we're looking for income, we're looking more for a dividend. If we're looking for growth, we're looking at capital gain longer term, right? So back to stocks, there are two basic stocks. One types of stock. One is common stock and one is preferred stock. Common stock is your typical stock, ordinary stock that is that you would purchase on, with you through your broker. Preferred stock is a little bit different. Preferred stock, the difference is common stock, you have rights as a voter. So those are voting shares of stock. Preferred stock, it sounds counterintuitive, but you don't have a vote. You don't have a say in how the company is going to be going forward, et cetera. But the advantage of preferred stock is if there are dividends issued, if there is profit sharing, if you will, preferred stockholders receive that first. So again, people often purchase stocks or stock-based mutual funds in search of dividends, that income, or that increased value that we talked about in terms of capital gain. So specifically, we're looking at corporate and government bonds. There are two types of bonds that investors should consider. A corporate bond is private side. So corporate, again, bonds are loans. Bonds, strictly speaking, they are loans. So what you're doing is that when you purchase a bond, you're lending money to a company or you're lending money to some entity, whether corporate or a public municipality, if you will. So maturity dates for most bonds range anywhere from about, they're shorter term, but those aren't really bonds. So it'd be 1 year to 30 years. There are other types of debt, if you will, that are shorter term, but anyway, we won't get into that. The value of a bond is closely tied to the ability of the corporation or government entity to repay the bond at maturity. So this is part of that risk that we talked about, that business failure, the risk of the business failing outright, if you will. Also keep in mind that the value of the bond may increase or decrease. Again, the reason that is because a bond may be issued at 10% rate of return interest that they would be getting. And if interest rates, overall interest rates go up, the company might issue another bond, same setup, but at 15%, for example. So if you look at it apples to apples, that 15% bond versus that 10% in interest earning, if you will, the 15% is worth more than the other one at 10%. As an aside, the payments on bonds are typically made every 6 months, and there are a variety of types that would be going forward. So back to what we said about mutual fund, specifically a mutual fund. I've talked about this and it should be rather clear at this point, but we'll go through it specifically. Mutual fund pools the money of many investors, its shareholders, to invest in a variety of securities. Securities meaning equities, shares of stock, etc., or bonds or bonds. Those are the securities, typically equity securities and debt securities. Okay. Professional management, there are some that are actively traded where they're actively trying to do things. Others are much more passive. I prefer the latter, the passive approach, where you have just broad-based index funds and you're just tracking to the market, but that's my preference. Another reason is that's so you have somebody that's actually investing for you in essence. Another reason is that it follows that asset allocation in terms of diversification, either within a segment, market sector, or across market sectors, large, medium, small cap, small size corporations, right? So the goal of one investor, of course, may differ from others. Managers of mutual funds they do realize this, and they try to put you into the package that you want. Say you want to just be with large size corporate corporations. You can do that. You can find mutual funds that are just for large cap, for S&P 500, Standard & Poor's 500, right? In many cases, mutual funds can also be used for retirement accounts, including IRAs, Roth IRAs, traditional IRAs, and 401ks as well. So onward. So we talked about bonds, we talked about stocks, and so on and so forth, and bonds, mutual funds, and real estate. As real estate increases in value and eventually sells for a profit. Reason being is that there is a limited amount of land, theoretically, right? I shouldn't say theoretically, there is a limited amount of land, but theoretically it should go up over a period of time because of the scarcity of the land. Anyway, it's not always the case, as we well know. So any investment has its advantages. The land in general is not very liquid, for one. And anyways, you get the idea. So other investment alternatives would include such things as speculative, and this is where people, they love to get into, and the fast money approaches, whether we're talking about options, commodity exchanges, looking into derivatives and precious metals, gemstones, coins, stamps, antiques, and collectibles. So without exception, the investment, these kind of normally referred to as speculative for one reason or another. At any rate, a lot of different ways in which you can invest your financial wealth, if you will. So personalize your investment. So you want to go through these and establish a plan. So to be successful, you must develop that plan, develop all these things into a plan, and then implement them. Individuals begin, when you're as an individual, you have to begin planning, if you will, establishing those realistic goals. And start small. No matter what you're going to, unless you've got a big chunk of money out there, you're going to be starting small, and realize that it's going to take some time for your money to grow, period. So keep that in mind. So onward. So factors that reduce investment risk. We're all about reducing our risk, right? So some factors, evaluating potential investments. So doing your homework on these. Monitoring the value of those investments and keeping accurate and current records. It's not really, you're not reacting all the time. This is kind of a takeaway from this, but you do have to have your head in the game, so to speak. Other factors to consider to achieve those goals. It might actually, if you're not comfortable with this, is to talk to a certified financial planner, etc. Especially a certified financial planner that is a fiduciary, meaning that they are a fiduciary for you. They're acting in your best interest. So they're treating your money like theirs, like they would do their own. Okay. So fiduciary is a very important point. So you have to be careful though when you run into other people like lawyers and accountants and so on and so forth, because those folks aren't necessarily the best folks for this. At any rate, lastly, I guess you'd say you want to make sure that you consider what the tax consequences are with your investment decisions, whether you're going to go with Roth IRAs or traditional IRAs or the buying and selling of your assets. There are tax consequences associated with buying and selling securities, obviously, because the taxes that would be part of it, if you will. So anyway, source of investment information, there's a ton out there. Internet is out there, is available for you, right? Lots of services on the internet, of course, but you get the idea. So onward to chapter 18. Starting early, right? So we're starting early. This is retirement planning. And there are a lot of cautionary tales, things to be very, very concerned with, because you cannot start too early. Not to beat you over the head with this, but it's very, very important to start early with your investment, with your retirement planning. And when I say early, I'm saying when you're 20 years old, or if you're 30 years old, you start where you start, but the earlier that you can start, the better off you'll be, right? So let's start with tackling the trade-offs that are associated with this. You can't have your cake and eat it too is part of this part retirement planning, meaning that you're talking about doing what? Deferring consumption. You're not consuming now, you're pushing that out to consume later on. That's really what we're saying. Um, that's the ultimate trade-off that we're talking about. So moving on. So the importance, if you will, of starting early. You don't wait until you're 40, 45, 50. And if you aren't 45, 50, 60 years old and you're just starting, uh, it's too late in terms of starting too late, but you start where you start, and this is the reality. This is life. But again, the takeaway is you start as early as you can. So it's vitally important for many reasons. You can expect to live in retirement maybe for many years. If not you, perhaps your significant other or the folks that you care about. So think about these things. Social Security can provide some, but we've talked about the shortfalls associated with Social Security, meaning it's not a tremendous amount of income for one, and secondly, we'll say within the next 10 years, unless things change, there's going to be a significant reduction in the payment of your actual Social Security benefit. So it could be reduced by as much as 25%. And also keep in mind that there's inflation that's always in play as well. So focus on the positive, the power of compounding. So the key to saving for retirement is to make your money work for you, again, through this power of compounding interest, if you will. So as the size of your savings grow, you can earn interest on an ever bigger, larger portion or pool of money, if you will. So back to the basics of retirement planning. The first step is to analyze where you're at with your assets and liabilities, estimate what your spending needs are going to be going forward, and adjust them for inflation. And be honest with yourself. If you want to do vacations or spend more time, doing things that are going to be more expensive, you've got to consider these things. You have to put this as part of that of the formula that you put together. So finally, again, you evaluate your planned retirement income, and if necessary, you work on increasing the amount that you set aside. You can never have enough. I shouldn't say that, but it's a kind of a general rule. Anyway, so conducting your financial analysis, review your assets, all of these things, your housing. Remember, your house is typically your largest single asset. Life insurance, what your life insurance situation is, savings bonds, and other things like that. Evaluate all these investments, trying to figure out exactly where you're at a given point in time. So this is reviewing. So retirement living expenses, your spending patterns will probably change. Things to some expenses may be higher, some expenses may be lower. Work expenses, of course, will be lower. Clothing expenses, presuming that you're buying work clothes, might be lower. Housing expenses, probably about the same, but they might be lower if you pay off your mortgage, for example. Your income would probably be reduced, so that the income tax part. Some of these, however, expenses may increase. Insurance costs, medical expenses, expenses for those leisure activities, those vacations that we talked about, and gifts and contributions, meaning gifts to your kids, your grandkids, etc., your nephews, nieces, so on and so forth. You may want the cost for this may go up in time, and this is all part. It could also be part of your getting rid of your assets, if you will, as you grow older as well, in terms of gifting more money to your children and so on and so forth. So adjust those. You always have to consider inflation. And so if you think that you're going to be getting a 10% rate of return on your investments, is that a real rate of return, or is that not taking into account inflation. So if the inflation is present, of course, it's going to be reducing that real rate of return. Planning your retirement housing. So where you live, the type of house, many options exist, whether you're talking about buying a new home and kind of making it um, uh, easier access for when you're older. And they're just things to avoid uh, these housing traps. And these are all available that are out there on the internet where you can look into property taxes, if you're thinking about moving to another state to retire, what the taxes are, income taxes, is your pension going to be taxed by the state, um, et cetera. Check whether the new state will give you credit for those taxes. So, for example, if you're liable for a pension tax on your income in Michigan, will the new state that you move to will they provide you some sort of credit for that? All these things to consider. And along with such things, so a friend of mine, for example, moved to the desert in Arizona. Beautiful, sounds great. It worked out very, very well, but he was stunned at the cost of, of electricity for the summer months, right? Because 100-degree plus days, you're running your air conditioning 24/7. Really, is what it comes down to. So you may want to rent if you're instead of buying immediately, meaning try it out, rent to own type of a situation. Planning that retirement income, possible sources would be Social Security, public pension plans, employer pension plans, personal retirement plans, and annuities. Social Security, for example, um, you can get Social Security at a reduced rate at age 62. And all the stuff that kind of goes along with this that would be associated with it. If you retire at 62 and 65, your benefits will be reduced. Um, if you, again, if you retire before age 67, actually, now I guess it would be. So estimating your retirement benefits, the SSA or Social Security Administration they've got this all available. Just look up ssa.gov. You should do this no matter what, just to see what it looks like in your account if you've worked at all or you've contributed with Social Security. You should check this on an annual basis to make sure that your income is correct. What your eligibility is for they refer to it as number of quarters, and a quarter is about a 3-month period of time. I think it's typically about 30 quarters, or we'll just say 8 years. So if you're working for 8 years, and you're paying into Social Security, then you are eligible for some sort of Social Security benefit and Medicare as well. Anyway, so there are other public pension plans as well, many city governments, state governments, and federal government as well. They offer retirement plans for their employees. The federal has changed, but the other two are certainly out there to one degree or another. And lastly, the employer pension plans this goes for municipals as well, for city, county, state, etc. They offer defined benefit plans or defined contribution plans. Defined benefit plan is a typical pension where you're guaranteed a certain amount per month. Defined contribution is typically set up so that you contribute to your 401k or 403b, kind of like an IRA type setup where your employer typically matches for a certain amount. Always, always, always contribute what you can, especially in pre-tax dollars. But if you have a Roth set up with post-tax dollars and you can afford to do it, that's also not a bad idea, because what that means is that when you're actually drawing your income upon retirement, for example, it's tax-free. Keep that in mind. Always a good option, right? So personal retirement plans, again, IRAs and KEOs. IRAs is individual retirement plan. Um, there are a variety of others that you can go through, but basically what we're talking about is don't know if they even talk about it here so much, but the Roth IRA is you're paying post-tax dollars, meaning you're taxed on the income and you put that into an IRA, and you don't have to pay taxes on that later on when you start to draw it out when you're retiring. Always the most important thing to keep in mind, two things. One is that at 59 and a half is when you're eligible, if you will, to start drawing out some of your IRA. Before that, you have a 10% penalty. So keep that in mind. And also, I think it's changed, but at about age 70, we'll just say 72 now, you have to start withdrawing a certain percentage every year. And the reason is they want you to spend this money on what? On your retirement. So keep this in mind. Roth IRA, different rules as well go along with it. Anyway, so onward. So annuity is basically you're setting up a payment plan going forward. So you're getting a certain amount every month, so on and so forth going forward. They can be fixed or variable, of course, but so the types of annuities are lump sum or single premium deferred annuity, meaning that the lump sum is that you're buying an annuity for $50,000 and spreading the payments out over X number of years, or the single premium, meaning that you're kicking a certain amount in every month and to be paid out, kind of you're doing a self-pension plan, if you will. Options and annuities, there are three major options for an annuity payoff. Straight life annuity, you receive an income for the rest of your life. Life annuity with installments earned, you receive an income for the rest of your life. If you die within a certain period after receiving income, usually 10 or 20 years, your beneficiary receives regular payments for the balance of that period. Installment refund annuity, you receive an income for the rest of your life. However, if you do die before receiving as much money as you paid in, your beneficiary receives regular income until the total payments equal that amount. Again, it's all about how this is paying off. So the straight life annuity is that you're paid until kind of a Social Security type of a setup. You're paid until you pass away, right? So you have to go through and determine which of these is the best option for yourself. It all depends on how you want to do this, right? So these are all different types of options that are out there for retirement. So now we're talking about living on your retirement income. First, you want to make sure that you're receiving all the income which you're entitled, Social Security, so on and so forth. And focus on taxes. Taxes can be, save you a few $100s to a few $1,000s, several $1,000s a year. You have to kind of be wary of this. And it's not that you want to focus on it entirely, but you want to make sure that you kind of address the tax issues. You may want to, if your income is not up to snuff that you're expecting, it's not where you want it to be, you may want to consider working a bit. 5 hours a week, 10, 20 hours a week, whatever you need to. So you have to make sure that you're paying attention to inflation and, dipping into your retirement funds is not, there's nothing wrong with that, but you have to make sure that you're paying attention to what the consequences are. Okay, sounds good, right? So you've got $1 million that's set aside. And so you're thinking, oh, that's going to last you, say you're expecting, we'll just say 10% a year. So you're expecting to receive 10% a year, so $100,000 a year sounds good in income. So that's what your expectations. That's too much, but you get the idea. So meaning that if you spend $100,000 a year, your $1 million is going to stay intact, your principal. So you're thinking, oh, well, maybe what I'll do is I'll splurge and I'll buy something for $100,000. And now what's happened, of course, is that your nest egg is shrunk from $1 million to $900,000, and you will not be getting that at 10%. You won't be getting $100,000 a year. You'll be getting $90,000 a year. And what happens if you continue to spend $100,000 a year? It reduces that value, that overall value. These are just things to kind of consider. So anyway, estate planning. Moving on to, let's see. Okay, we've already talked. Oops. So chapter 19, I kind of lost track of where I was at there. But anyway, estate planning. So with estate planning, first off, when you're talking about an estate, that means your entire portfolio, your physical assets, your financial assets, everything you own, etc. That is your estate. And what we're saying that your estate, when you die, what happens to all the stuff that you own? So you want to make sure that there's an orderly, it passes in an orderly manner to whomever you want to pass that along to. Anyway, you get the idea. This is the whole idea behind that, is that you're planning on what is going to happen, what after you die. Really is what it is. So in general, most people are living longer, and we've already talked about the actual estate planning is that plan for the administration and the disposition of your property after you die, after you pass, if you will. All right. So estate planning, again, of course, is an essential part of retirement planning and integral in your financial planning, because you want to make sure that your assets are going to go where you want them to go after you're gone. You may not care, but at the same time, the people that follow you or the people that you want to take care of, they do care. So you have to think about these things kind of holistically, if you will. If you're married, it's pretty straightforward. Typically, uh, uh, your assets would be passed on to your spouse. Um, but you also have to consider what is going to happen, uh, how this is going to impact your spouse, not your death, but your estate, your assets. How is that going to be? How are you going to pass it on? If you're never married, you want to know who your beneficiaries are going to be, um, who it is that you want to pass this along to. If you say if you were to die tomorrow, who do you want to receive? Uh, your house. Do you want the house sold and donated to some charity or something? Anyways, there are all these. This is what we're talking about as we're looking at this. So there's an opportunity cost, if you will, and it's called the opportunity cost of rationalizing. And what we're saying is that all these things that happen pretty close to the after you die, dealing with funeral homes, lawyers, insurance agents, banks, and so on and so forth. They're usually very, very helpful, but uh, they don't have a vested stake, if you will, in your estate. They're there to help people, but they're still not. Uh, uh, this is why you want to have something set in place beforehand, so whoever you're leaving your money to or whatever your assets are, uh, it will be uh, transferred over to them with as little as few problems as possible. Anyways, legal aspects, if you will, of estate planning. Um, you have to have uh, the papers that you want to make sure that you have somewhere safe, secure: birth certificates, marriage certificates, any legal name changes, any military service records, and the documents that we're going to talk about when we're looking at in terms of wills and trust. Starting with wills, a will is a legal declaration of a person's mind at the disposition of his or her property after their passing, after they die. If you die intestate without a valid will, the state's law of descent and distribution becomes your will, meaning that the state takes over. The state, meaning if you're in Michigan, the state of Michigan steps in the form of what's called a probate court, and they find out how to dispose of your assets, right? So there are different types of wills, four basic types: simple will, um, the traditional marriage share will, the exemption trust, and the stated dollar amount. So simple will is very straightforward: is that I hereby declare or bequeath the following to so on and so forth, and everything basically goes to your spouse. If you have, and it's for most cases, it's fairly sufficient, except if it's complicated, the more complicated it is, the more likely it is that you'll move away from a simple will. Traditional marriage share will leaves one half of the adjusted gross estate to your spouse, and the other half go to the children upon or their heirs, if you will. Exemption trust will has gained popularity in recent years. Under this type of will, everything passes to your spouse with the exception of an amount equal to the exemption, whatever that exemption is, whatever your set aside is. Stated dollar amount will allows you to pass to your spouse any amount that satisfies your objectives. They may or may not include tax considerations. So which one is best? It all depends. Typically, the marital share, the traditional marital share, will cover it if you are married. So the formats of the wills, how the actual wills are set up, holographic will is handwritten will, and those are typically they're not valid in many states. This is you've seen these all the time. I'm going to leave 5 cows and 3 chickens to so on and so forth. These are not that they have to be something that simple, but that's a holographic will. It's all by hand, not witnessed. It's something with the person's signature, of course. A formal will is issued, it's prepared with an attorney's assistance, and a statutory will, and it's signed off by witnesses. And a statutory will is pre-printed form, maybe like something through Willmaker where you put it through yourself. So writing your will, the way you transfer your property according to your wishes is to write a will specifying what those wishes are. You have to select an executor. An executor that's the person whose job it is to execute the will, to make happen what it is you desire to happen, right? And it could be a friend, relative, so on and so forth. It could be anybody, really. And there are fees, of course, that would be paid to the executor, because they're the ones that have to go through all the reconciling things, your financial statements, etc. So a guardian is they assume the responsibility for any children or dependents that are left behind. A trustee is a person or an institution that holds or generally manages the property for the benefit of someone else under a trust agreement, if you will. So altering or rewriting your will, if you have a will, you should review it. If you move to a different state, if you sold property, the size or the composition of your estate changed significantly, you bought assets, sold assets, and you stipulate in your will what it is those assets are. This has to be re-racked, has to be redone. Married, divorced, remarried, new potential heirs have died or been born. All these things that go along with it. This is reviewing. You want to make sure that you do that. Anyway, living wills and advanced directives. A living will provides you with the wishes to be followed if you become so physically or mentally disabled that you're unable to act on your own behalf. And this is where you set up durable powers of attorney, so on and so forth. Ethical will is a way to pass on your values and beliefs to your heirs and is not legally binding. Social media will, you can imagine what that is. How your accounts are set up. Your Facebook accounts and so on and so forth, how they're going to be dispossessed, how they're going to be taken care of, if you will, after your passing. Again, the power of attorney is a legal document authorizing someone to act on your behalf, whether we're talking about financially, typically, or medically, for sure. Durable medical power of attorney. Finally, last letter of last instruction. Those are when you stipulate your what it is you want done, what it is, where things are at, account numbers, passwords, all those things that are important, if you will, to you to pass along. Moving on, types of trust and estate of trust. Then we talked about wills. A trust is a legal arrangement through which your assets are held by a trustee for your benefit or for that of your beneficiaries and or your beneficiaries. In a revocable trust or revocable trust, you retain the right to alter the terms of the trust, etc., during your lifetime. If it's irrevocable, you cannot change those terms or end it. These are general things in general. Revocable, irrevocable. You can't change irrevocable, obviously. Benefits that are associated with establishing trust. Some common benefits of setting up trust are reducing estate taxes, avoiding probate. By all means, avoid probate. Even with a will, there are some probate possibilities to go through with the will, but with trust, you can avoid that altogether. Freeing yourself from the management of your assets, providing income for your beneficiaries, and ensuring that your property serves the desired purpose after your passing, after you die. So there are different types of trust: a credit shelter trust or a bypass trust, a residuary trust, an AB trust, blah, blah, it goes on and on. They're designed to allow married couples to take full advantage of the exemptions that allow 5.45 million in every estate to pass free of federal estate tax. Most people fall under that, of course. So you're avoiding the taxes that would be associated with passing your assets onto your loved one. So it goes right directly to your spouse. Disclaimers trust is appropriate for a couple who does not yet have enough assets to need a credit shelter trust, but may need one in the future. A living or inter vivos trust, a living trust, is a property management arrangement that you establish while you're still alive. A testamentary trust is established by your will and becomes effective upon your death. So it's an instrument under the will. A life insurance trust is established, again, still while you're living. So your estate, once again, it's everything you own, including all your property that's tangible, intangible, community properties, any property, if you will, that's acquired by either you or your spouse during your marriage, but not by gift, etc. So it's something that it's shared property. It's community property between you and your spouse. Joint ownership of property between spouses, typically common. It's typically the way things are. While joint ownership may avoid probate, it does not avoid federal estate taxes. There are three types of joint ownership, if you will: tenants and right of survivorship, tenants in common, tenancy by the entirety. Most cases, if you have a spouse, it's joint tenants with the right of survivorship, and it just passes on to the surviving spouse. Tenants in common, the assets are disposed of typically upon the demise, if you will, the passing of one of the owners. Anyway, life insurance and employee benefits are free of income tax. Keep that in mind. Life insurance are tax-free, excluded from probate, and wholly or partially exempt from most state inheritance taxes. Again, something to keep in mind. Lifetime gifts and trust, gifts or trust with strings attached, such as retaining the income used or control of the property, are fully included at their date of death value, whether your rights are expressed or implied. So again, going through these processes within your estate, you can stipulate exactly what you want done with your property, with your estate. And when I say property, I don't mean just necessarily your real estate. I'm talking about all of your financial portfolio or your physical portfolio, your house, your car, etc. So settling your estate, if you have your estate, if you have a will, your executor can carry out your wishes in due time. If not, if you haven't named an executor, the probate will appoint an administrator to carry out the instructions in your will. So takeaway is have an executor. No one likes the idea of being an executor, but have an executor. So onward. So the maximum tax that the federal and state estate tax, the maximum tax rates on estates and gifts has been declining. I don't know if that's going to continue to be the case. You can reduce your taxable estate by giving assets away during your lifetime. You can do that on an annual basis. You can gift a certain amount. So types of taxes, 4 major taxes: estate income taxes, inheritance taxes, and gift taxes. And estate tax is a federal tax levied on the right of the deceased person to transmit her property and life insurance at death. Estates and federal income taxes, in addition to the federal estate tax, estates and certain trusts must file federal income tax returns with the IRS. Inheritance taxes levied on the right of an heir to receive all or part of the estate and the life insurance proceeds of a deceased person. Gift taxes, the federal and state government levy a gift tax on the privilege of making gifts to others. Death and taxes, right? Taxes are always there. Many states have gift tax laws. The state gift tax are similar, if not the amount, but they're usually set up pretty much the same as the federal gift tax laws. So it's all about what? Tax avoidance, and but not tax evasion. Avoidance is legal, evasion is not. So again, avoidance is illegal use and to reduce your tax liability, if you will. Evasion of taxes, of course, means that you can go to jail, right? You can be prosecuted. Anyway, gifts made to certain recognized charities, etc., are exempt from gift estates and inheritance taxes. So these are all things to consider. Calculating the tax, the estate tax applied to your net taxable estate at death, debts and liabilities, and arriving at your taxable estate. The amount of your debts and creditor obligations are subtracted, so you subtract out any outstanding debt or any other liabilities that you might have. Probate administrative costs. These costs include fees for attorneys, and they can mount up very quickly. So this is why it's important to do these things up front. And lastly, paying that tax. Paying the tax within, I think it's within a year, or might be within a shorter, I think 9 months rather. Anyway, that's it, folks. That's it for chapter 19.